Welcome to the Sales Enablement Innovation Podcast, brought to you by the Sales Enablement Collective. Each episode, we sit down with sales enablement and revenue leaders from around the world and invite them to share their expertise and experience with the community. On this episode, we spoke to Andrew Flores, Director of Revenue Enablement at Knowde, about the power of using a competency-based approach to onboarding. I hope you enjoy our conversation. On the show today is Andrew Flores. Thank you, Andrew, for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
So before we dive in, could you introduce yourself to our listeners and give a bit of background on your enablement experience, your career journey, what you've been up to so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Director of Revenue Enablement at Knowde, and we are a tech company that is really transforming the way that chemical companies go to market. And harness their product master data. Let's see, the journey of my enablement career, it actually started in a tire shop. So funny story, I didn't really know what to do after college, and my dad was the vice president of a national tire chain. So I went to go sell tires. And one thing I loved about sales was being able to teach people what I was selling and then teach fellow sellers how to sell better. So that was something that really piqued my interest in actually the motion of teaching people how to sell. I share that because not many people go from like blue collar to tech. But I really enjoyed the hard work it taught me. And so, yeah, from there, went to Rackspace. Really jumped into a tech sales career, but I had my eye on enablement from the very beginning. Had an awesome onboarding experience, and then after that, went to Auth0, which was a startup. Really jumped into even more full cycle sales. Finally got onto the enablement team, and then it's just been history from there. So got to see Auth0 go into acquisition by Okta. Went to Fingerprint, helped them build out their enablement motion from the ground up, and now I'm at Knowde doing the same.
That's really cool and such a unique sort of entry into enablement as well. I think it really goes to show like there really is a million ways to get into enablement. Everyone has such a sort of unique story about it, which is really cool. And today we're diving into onboarding as our topic today. You mentioned you had a really great onboarding experience sort of in your career as well, and specifically around sort of the using competencies. But before we go too much further, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of onboarding? What are those sort of key points when you think onboarding? This is what I'm sort of, what comes to mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of think of it as what word comes to mind. I think that word is momentum. So our role is to really help people build momentum early on, right? There can't be too many lags. They want to feel like they're making progress every day. And someone actually asked me recently, is your onboarding program more structured or is it like drinking from a fire hose? And my answer was, it's like structured drinking from a fire hose, right? It's going to be a lot. It's meant to be a lot. You have a lot to learn, but there's ways that we can balance that over the course of weeks, different types of, you adjust it for different types of learning styles, knowledge checks, role plays. There's ways to distribute that really heavy learning load in order to make sure that they are competent in what they need to be in after onboarding.
That's really interesting. And something we spoke about when organizing the episode was the idea of onboarding through competencies rather than capabilities. What's the difference between the two, and sort of why do you prefer a competency-based approach? I'm sure some people are listening and thinking, oh, well, maybe for them, capabilities and competencies are sort of similar. Where's that sort of difference for you?
Yes, good question. So this is actually a new learning for me. So this is why I love enablement. Is like you could be farther down in your career and still you have a mentor. In this case, my current boss, who was the VP of sales at Knowde, but he was in enablement for years. And so he's really helped me reframe the onboarding program of being a competency based approach versus capabilities. So what I mean by that is capabilities obviously is what you can do. Competency is what do you know and do you know why that's important? You know how to apply it. So there's just a deeper level of understanding and learning there if you look at it from a competency-based approach. Many times you kind of think of onboarding as reps need to perform certain actions and have baseline knowledge, right? But like, what are they competent in truly? So here's just a quick example that just to help dig in a little bit deeper is you could give someone discovery questions and a product quiz and even get them to record themselves doing an intro call deck. But, how are we going to build competency into that learning too, so that they understand why the prospect's answers to your discovery questions show alignment with the solutions that you offer as a company, right? So how are we making sure that like our discovery is aligned with the business outcomes that we're out in the market providing? So just that next level of understanding. So there is and it comes a lot from like practicing in the wild, role playing, feedback, certification by the stakeholders who help you line out what competencies they want to see in the reps. So that's what I mean by more of a deeper competency based approach.
That's really fascinating, and it makes sense. I think if a seller has that sort of deeper level of understanding, it's better reflected in sort of the outcomes that they can bring as well. When you sort of first started using this competency based approach, you said it's sort of new to you. Did you have any sort of mindset shifts or attitude shifts that you have to make, or that our listeners should be aware of as well if they're trying on planning on trying something like this as well? Like what's that mentality like that you kind of have to move into if you're sort of putting competency first?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you have to start asking yourself different questions, like of yourself and the enablement program. You're trying to teach them things that seem intangible from an onboarding perspective or hard to operationalize, like how to teach business acumen of the industry that you're in. So, for example, if someone you want someone to prospect effectively, you can tell them what to look for when researching and all day, right? But are we really helping them understand like what you found, why that matters in the context of prospecting, and how that has to do with the messaging you're going to construct for prospecting? So you kind of move from getting people resources for execution to teaching them the business acumen they need to actually use that resource well. And so you kind of go beyond of like just having a great onboarding program to what kind of reps is this program producing? So that's a question I have having to ask myself quite a bit more. Is like, how is this a great program? Okay, what kind of reps are we producing here with this program? So I actually work with an amazing coaching firm called Novus Global, and they help me flip a lot of the questions of how to be the best into a question of what am I capable of? And when you start asking yourself that question of like, what am I actually capable of? You start to push yourself to the limits of where you're comfortable, but also just the capabilities that you have in as an enabler to go out and get really creative. Start to design things that are coming from a place where you're asking yourself just fundamentally different questions about your program.
That's really interesting, and I'm wondering off the back of that as well. With this sort of deeper approach, and sort of you mentioned like how to teach business acumen, which actually has a little bit more to it than maybe your standard onboarding. Is there a sort of an additional time? Is the onboarding programs sort of look a little bit longer than maybe other companies with this approach? Just thinking for the listeners who are maybe wondering about the sort of nuts and bolts of implementing it. Should they expect to put a little bit more time, maybe ramp up time that's slightly slower, but then reaps towards later? Or how do you see that, I guess?
Yeah, good question. I've traditionally thought of programs or when I design them as broken into three parts, which is like a natural progression of product, process, and then practical application. But now I've woven in these competencies more into like even these first product sessions. It's like, okay, well, let's learn about the product and let's learn about the challenges we've solved. And then, you're adding on more of knowledge checks earlier on in the program so that you can start to see how those competencies are being built. And so you can still have like a 6 week program, for example, that's like an intensive onboarding. It's just going to have different flavors and different elements, but it depends on the company, depends on the segment, right? So if I'm building an enterprise onboarding, that's going to take just a little bit longer than if something it's like these are excuse me, a little bit shorter because if you have brand new reps who have never sold before, your sell in like an SMB motion, you're actually having to teach a lot more process than with someone who's a little bit seasoned. But regardless, it's about designing and mapping out those competencies before you even begin, and that will dictate how much time you need.
That makes sense. And with this sort of approach, how are you measuring success? Is it the usual, is it quote unquote usual metrics? Is there other factors that you're sort of paying more attention to? When you're sort of reporting the success as well, sort of further up the chain, what does the sort of those success metrics look like for you?
Yeah. So, the usual metrics are usual because they're foundational, right? They're tried and true, ramp time, how fast they're getting to quota, those types of things. But what I like to do is also build in ways for the stakeholders who communicate to me the competencies they need in their reps to actually verify those competencies towards the end of onboarding or even like mid-level, right? Like mid-level onboarding, where are we at? So there's just a lot more pulse checks and understanding like how competent are my reps coming out of onboarding. So here's an example, right? This is a small example. If my VP of sales says to me, hey, I really want my reps to be competent, excuse me, in crafting persona-based messaging, by week 3, for example. based on what use case resonates with the prospect that they're going after. Well, you better be sure that not only am I going to teach this and give them the tools to do it and check understanding, but then they're going to have to write an email to that VP of sales for that VP of sales to grade, give feedback, and also just have a culture of understanding where this is not really pass or fail. It's how did you do? Do we need to go back? Do we need to make sure that you are more competent in doing what you're going to be doing day in and day out after onboarding? Or, hey, this is actually really great. It looks like you're catching on quite a bit. So they are more qualitative, but making them situational actually adds a lot of weight because you're involving more of the stakeholders versus like you'll go through a 6 week onboarding and then you give that person back to their manager and then the manager's like, oh wait, they really don't know this and they don't know this, so you're checking that along the way. Um, and it ends up being kind of a referendum of the rep, not just the rep, but like your program enablement's performance. So there is a good healthy pressure on enablement to make sure that like the competencies are there in the program because they'll be verified.
That makes sense. I really like that idea of it's not being pass or fail. It's like sort of feedback based and a little bit more qualitative. There's a lot to learn from that as well. You've obviously sort of been converted to this method. You're sort of using it and you're passionate about it. What would you say to a listener who's maybe on the fence and saying, "Oh, well, the way I'm doing it is good. It works. It's okay." Sort of, is there something that like you've really taken away from using this competency based approach to sort of elevate onboarding? What would be that sort of to nudge them onto the your side of the fence?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think there's a lot. I have an amazing network of fantastic people in enablement, and everyone does onboarding a little bit differently, and then everyone kind of does it similarly. One thing that I had to move away from was like just holding on to the onboarding checklist for dear life and being like, they have to get these things done in 6 weeks. And it's more like, what do they need to know in 6 weeks? It may not look like a checklist of like boom, 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 boom. Hey, you got everything done, go sell. It might be like what I described to you before. There's just more like events that are happening within onboarding. So that's the first place to start is really just like look at your checklist or like your onboarding. Everyone has an onboarding checklist and say, how much is that just like check they've done it? Or if it is, how can I check they actually know it?
I really like that approach, and it's just a subtle difference, but it can make a big difference as well. But before recording, we also talked a little bit about sort of using onboarding or enablement using onboarding as a way to sort of be a culture ambassador for new hires. What are your thoughts on that? Why do you think sort of enablement is actually uniquely suited to this, and sort of the idea of being a culture ambassador? Sort of where does that come from for you?
Yeah, this is a favorite topic of mine. This is actually what got me into enablement when I was at Rackspace. I came in as entry level seller. They had a killer onboarding, and it just made me realize like you could facilitate an amazing experience for new reps and set the bar really high for company culture by personifying that just from day one. Right. And that's actually, as soon as I got out of onboarding, I was like, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life is facilitate these experiences, teach people, cultivate people from the beginning, and make sure also everyone's aligned with how we're expected to work from a company culture standpoint. Enablement also interacts with so many orgs that we can be examples of company culture and action between teams. Treat everyone the way we want to be treated, how you're supposed to treat people from like a company culture perspective, and it can be pretty contagious.
I really like that. And do you have any sort of advice for enablement individuals or teams who maybe don't know where to start with that, or maybe there isn't that sort of element of culture built into their onboarding? Where do you get started with that? And maybe especially if you don't maybe have the resources to do a Rackspace style sort of onboarding that sort of captivated you so well. Where does someone start to like sort of start putting that sort of culture piece into their onboarding?
Yeah, so I think you can use the resources you have, right? So the people team in every company is going to define like cultural values for the company, right? The company values. And you can personify those, right? So for example, when I worked at Fingerprint, they had an amazing value called Be Level 5 Helpful. If you haven't read the article Be Level 5 Helpful, it's like how you can be very helpful as like a new hire. Great article. And so one of the things I did was make it required reading for all of the new hires. so that they understood what that even means. And then, making sure that I was executing that and then expecting that of other people. So one of the principles of being level 5 helpful is making sure that you're giving as much context as possible when you're asking for help, and helping yourself as much first before you go ask for help. And so I will, do that. Say, hey, personify what the company expects, how people expect to execute this value. And then also, if it's not given to me, if someone just seems like a vague ask, I feel like I'm empowered to ask back, well, what's the context? Where have you looked? Like, what have you done so far? And so it's a two-way street, right? You're sort of expecting that of other people, but you're also holding yourself to that same standard, so you're not a hypocrite.
That makes a lot of sense. And then if you're that sort of first point of contact, especially during onboarding, you do set that example. That makes a lot of sense. And in terms of that sort of culture piece, again, is that something that's more qualitative in terms of you kind of feel that it's working and that you feel like you're instilling that culture? Or do you actually have sort of metrics that you look at and say, like, yes, there was X metric went up, that sort of initiative we've been working on for culture has worked? Or is it more of a feel thing that you can sort of see as your sort of time in an organization goes on?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever put metrics behind it, just because it's a very daily thing. Like you really have to say, okay, you have to make the choice to want to be a greater contributor to the company culture, especially in a startup environment where like these may be values that are 6 months old, or like we just designed those, or these are new. So it's like you have to really, again, gain momentum in building out the company, helping to build out the company that you want to see thrive. And so I haven't really looked at any metrics behind it, but that's a very interesting concept. I'd be curious to see what it would do if you really made it like an initiative to do that.
I like that. Yeah, it's interesting. Before we wrap up, if listeners should just take away one thing from this episode, and in terms of their sort of the most important thing that you think you can sort of put across to someone who's thinking about competency based onboarding, or just sort of onboarding as a whole, what should it be? What's the sort of golden nugget that you want to leave with people before we wrap up?
Yeah. One of the things that's a great thing to do, I guess, if we're going to kind of tie this in a bow around onboarding and competencies, is when you're scoping the needs of your onboarding program with key stakeholders. I mentioned my VP of sales. It could be a CEO. I mean, it could be all over the map, right? A CS leader, if you're building a CS onboarding program. Treat that scoping like you would expect your reps to do discovery in like an actual deal, right? So ask the important questions about the competencies, ask implication questions, make sure you really understand what they need to see, why that's important, and then ask for their buy-in. Right. Like I mentioned before, if you're going to involve some stakeholders in some of the knowledge checks, make sure they're very clear and aware in their busy schedule of how they can be a part of this, how they can check to make sure that the onboarding program is working, and then go deliver or design and deliver a world-class product. But you really have to do this like foundational knowledge gathering before you go build. That is also, it's not new for me, but I think it's something I have to remind myself, because it's like, okay, this is my third company where I'm going to go build an onboarding program. I've got all of these best practices. I've done this before. And it's like, wait, okay, we really need to dig in deep to make sure I'm not just getting ahead of myself with what I think should be good onboarding, which, yes, I'm going to trust a lot of those things I learned along the way. But I do need to understand from like a company standpoint, what are these stakeholders looking for? What would it mean to have like a world-class onboarding for them? And then what happens if we don't hit those metrics by that certain time? And so those are just like classic sales discovery questions you just need to use internally.
I really like that. It's almost enablement, practicing what it preaches to the sellers and actually using it as a sort of extension of onboarding as well. That's really cool. And I think it's really insightful as well, because every day is a school day. If you're in a new company, maybe there's something that you hadn't even considered, that they have a sort of requirement there, and it's not something you want to overlook. So that was really, really valuable. I really appreciate that. And I think we're gonna have to wrap it up there. But Andrew, thank you so much for coming onto the show and sharing that. I found it really interesting. I thought it was a sort of really interesting perspective flip, and something that I think a lot of neighbors can learn from. Hopefully our listeners will have taken away a lot from that as well. So thank you for taking the time and coming on to share that.
Yes, thank you for reaching out and inviting me on. I'm happy to chat with you. It's been great.
Thanks for tuning in to the Sales Enablement Innovation Podcast. Be sure to follow us on your podcast platform of choice so you don't miss a thing. And if you're hungry for more sales enablement content, visit our website, salesenablementcollective.com, for articles, events, and an easy way to join our Slack community, home to thousands of your sales enablement peers.